All right, so this next subunit is going to be on sustainability. It's just kind of a culmination of everything we've learned so far. And we've got one more, I think, on technology. All right, so the objectives of this subunit are going to be to compare and contrast the impact of differing human lifestyles on sustainability and to describe future sustainability using graphs and current data. Um, a lot of science is going to be based off of graphs and models and just data predictions and being able to look at data and trend lines and make some sort of hypothesis based on that. So it's really important that you guys know how to use graphs and how to read graphs and models and data predictions, because in the future, that's kind of what our world is going to be run on, is scientific predictions, graphs, models, just a lot of data sets. So I want you guys to make sure that you're trying to at least be more literate with reading graphs and models. That's why I put them in this all the time. I know it's hard, but it actually is very important for the future of the Earth. And we can use graphs and data models for pretty much anything. It doesn't have to be like an environmental thing. We use them for economy, trends in what movies are coming out, that type of stuff. So you can use it for everything. Statistics are wonderful. All right, so let's get into sustainability. So sustainability is just the idea of meeting present needs while maintaining resources for future needs. So just the idea of like not being short-sighted, and we have a really, really bad problem with that as humans. The whole time that we've been humans, we've had a really, really tough time with looking towards the future and trying to be sustainable for future generations. So we really need to start thinking about that and try and be more cognizant about it. So we have renewable and non-renewable resources. So we know that. They need water for agriculture, energy, environment. All of these things use renewable and non-renewable resources. So we've got water sustainability is a big thing. Groundwater is our major source of fresh water. It's like 30% of our freshwater source, and our freshwater is only 3% of all of the water on the earth. So, if you think about it, we don't really have all that much. So, groundwater is mainly supplied by aquifers. And if you remember from past lectures, groundwater is just water that kind of fills into pores in the soil. So it's not just like this huge lake that you can go swimming around in under the water. It's just soil that's been permeated with water. So it's just like really, really damp soil, basically. And aquifers feed into wells and springs. So that's how we get a lot of our water. We've got a thing called a water budget, and essentially that's just the amount of water that we can take out based on how much is being put back in. So that's recharge and discharge. So recharge is when like a tributary puts water into a system, and discharge is when we take it out or that water goes, like say from the Mississippi River down to the Gulf of Mexico. That's going to be a discharge, but it's also a recharge into the Gulf of Mexico. So the only time we have a negative discharge is when we take it out and don't put it back into the system. So if we discharge more than we recharge, we lose viable sources of water, and that resource becomes non-renewable. So we can make a renewable resource non-renewable, and we've talked about that. So let's get into groundwater a little bit. How we get our groundwater is through groundwater pumping, and if we pump too much, it's going to reduce our water storage in the groundwater. That's if if we're discharging more than is recharged into that system, we're going to reduce the water storage. The water table is going to lower. So that's going to reduce river flow, obviously. There's not water going into rivers, so the river is going to have less water to move. So that's going to reduce the flow. That's going to reduce surface water levels because groundwater is recharging into certain systems. It's going to reduce wetland and spring discharge. So this is where we get our water, is springs and wells. So it's going to reduce the amount of water that is in a wetland or a spring. And wetlands are super important. I keep telling you this. One thing that happens is groundwater contamination. So a lot of agricultural practices contaminate groundwater through fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation, tillage, We've talked about all of these things, so it's just kind of a culmination. And then we've got urban contamination. So that's like when the surface water contaminates into the groundwater. So that's going to be like storm drains, or if we have like a hurricane, all that water just goes on top of the asphalt. It collects pollutants. It goes into the storm drains. The storm drains then go back into the water system. They don't get cleaned out like our sewage systems do. So here's just a wonderful picture. We've got all of our household waste. It goes into a sanitary sewer system. Then that goes to a water treatment plant. They treat it, they make it clean, and then it goes back to us. So this is actually like our poop water is more sanitary than the storm drains. Because the storm drains, they just catch water, catch pollutants, catch all sorts of gross stuff, and that just goes right back into our waterway. And then we have to use that water. So it's kind of a funny thing to think about, but the sewer systems are a lot more sanitary than just storm drains, which is funny because this is like all of our poop. So we've got agricultural sustainability we need to talk about. So we've got some soil conservation practices. Conservation tillage, I talked about it in the last subunit. That's when you leave crop residue on the topsoil. You don't turn it up and put the pollutants back into the topsoil. So it's going to increase soil nutrients actually. It's going to decrease erosion and increase water quality. So with more erosion, there is a decrease in water quality through that sedimentation that we talked about. Soil conservation practices will also include the decreased use of fertilizer, pesticides, and herbicides. So if we stop using these as much with those, a lot of like companion plants or like ladybugs, those types of things that we talked about earlier, that's going to decrease a lot of this this like pollution back into the system. Not only the soil, but the water, and then also the air. So we got this thing called carbon sequestration. I've talked about it a couple times before, but essentially plants sequester carbon, and that means that they just take it in from the atmosphere and they use it to grow. The main building block for all living organisms is carbon, and especially with plants, they just take that directly from the atmosphere, and then through their processes of photosynthesis, they turn that into like building blocks to make them grow. So essentially what they're doing is they're taking in carbon dioxide, turning it into carbon, and then growing with that. So they just hold that carbon in from the atmosphere. They take it out and they don't release it until they die and we like burn it up or that goes into the soil again. So it's just going to be the reduction of carbon emissions in the atmosphere by increasing carbon storage in the soil, which increases soil quality, which decreases erosion, which increases air quality, and increases water quality. So here's a picture, just a really quick one of how the soil sequesters carbon. So carbon's going to go into the plants. The plants are going to push that carbon down into their roots. They're also going to use it to grow. And then that carbon down into the roots is going to go into that humic layer, which is just, it's like the living layer of soil. We've got little microbes and small little animals in there that are going to use that carbon. So that carbon that comes from the atmosphere into the ground stays there, and it gets used up. Eventually it's going to come back out, but not as much because it leads to the growth of this humic layer. So it's just staying there. So sustainability of energy. We've got alternatives that we talked about. Wind, water, soil are really good examples. But we also have biofuels. So ethanol is a biofuel. E85, that's what we use for our cars mostly. It's an additive. And it's biomass energy, which is just organic materials. So they already account for the carbon output through their sequestration. So any organic material that we turn into biofuel has already sequestered carbon from the atmosphere. So all we're doing is releasing the same amount that we've sequestered. And honestly, it's a little less. So they're good things. Even though they do release carbon dioxide, that's already accounted for through this sequestration process. It leads to environmental sustainability, alternatives do, and they lower greenhouse gases. So alternative energy is great for good land and production practices. Increasing recycling is good for that. Increased use of recycled materials and more efficient energy technologies. Those are all going to lower our greenhouse gases and have more sustainable environments. So Here's just a really, really awesome thing to look at. This is how long it takes for things to break down in the natural environment. So this is in Florida. So they have a lot of water inundation. So it's going to take less time in Florida to break things down than it is in, say, a desert environment like Colorado. So a cigarette butt takes 10 to 12 years. So stop throwing those on the ground. And then the one that I really wanted to talk about was, we don't have it here, but it's glass. So glass never biodegrades. It stays in the atmosphere forever, or in the geosphere forever if you just leave it there. But the awesome thing about glass is that it can be recycled an infinite number of times. So every time you throw away a glass container, that just goes into the landfill and it stays there forever. You are really, really increasing or decreasing sustainability every time you throw away glass. So be cognizant of that. You can recycle it. We have the recycling plants necessary for that, and it can be recycled infinite amount of times, and that helps the economy as well. So just recycle. Here's just a nice little graphic here of recycling one glass wine bottle. Saves enough energy to power a television for 2.5 hours. Glass makes up about 10% of all the rubbish we throw away. It's 100% recyclable, and in the UK, 85% of green glass bottles are made with at least 85% recycled glass. So they're on the right track there. So we've got population increases. That doesn't lead to sustainability. The world's population is steadily increasing. It's projected a 40% increase by 2050, and so this is when a lot of catastrophic things are predicted to start happening, is 2050. It's going to increase our resource needs, developing versus developed countries. That's a big deal right there. Developed have less people, but we use more stuff. So we actually have a really bad ecological footprint. So here's just the age pyramid of developing versus developed countries. We've got relatively sustainable populations here. That's a good thing. We don't live sustainably, however. And then in developed countries, they have a huge amount of young people, but not very many old people. So that's just kind of how they deal with things. And then here's just the developed versus developing nations. So right here, we're developed, most of Europe, Australia, but then you've got pretty much all of Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and South America, and Mexico are developing. So we're going to see large increases in population there, and also CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions are going to rise because they're going to be trying to get to our developed status. So then here is just a graph of the billions of people in the world, and by 2050 we're projected to have around 10 billion people. And this blue one is developing countries. You can see this sharp uptick right about 1960, whereas developing or developed countries hasn't really risen all that much. So, resource, let's see where we're at here. All right, I'll just make another video. We'll stop right here, and the next video will be very short.